So welcome. Thank you all for being here today at the California Water Data Consortium's Data for Lunch with Anna Holder from the State Water Resources Control Board. I'm Tara Moran, CEO of the California Water Data Consortium. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the consortium, we were founded in 2019 to support implementation of the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, sometimes referred to as AB 1755. And as all of you well know, data can and should be at the heart of informed water management decision, both here in California and beyond. And that really is the vision for the consortium, which is a partnership between the state, NGOs, private sector, academia, and others. And our goal really is to support the development of and improved accessibility to high quality, trusted water data to support better outcomes for everyone living and working in California. And so our goals for the Data for Lunch series are to learn about new and innovative water data related methods or technologies, to share important learnings on water data topics, and importantly, to provide a venue for us to learn from and connect with one another. And so last year in 2021, the consortium went through a collaborative internal process to develop a vision and mission statement, along with guiding principles and goals for the consortium for the next 3 years. And I'm showing an image here. That came out of that process. And I won't go into detail, but if you haven't had a chance to see the materials from that process, I'd encourage you to go to our website where we have links to both the vision, mission, principles, and goals document, as well as the work plan that came out of that process. But the reason that I bring all of this up is that as part of this process, we also developed programmatic priorities for this upcoming year for 2022. And we really want to use the Data for Lunch series to focus on 2 key priorities for the upcoming year. And those include communicating the value of water data for improved water outcomes, but also increasing representation of a diversity of voices in the water data community, both within the consortium and beyond. And so with those goals in mind, I'm really pleased to have Anna Holder here with us today to talk about her experience with intentional engagement to advance equity, inclusion, and belonging in the water data community. So I'm particularly excited to hear from Anna, both because of the priorities that I just outlined, but also because we've been working alongside the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board, as well as others, in an equity work group to really think about how we can better learn from and engage with underrepresented communities in our own work. And this work will be getting underway this year, and we're currently in the process of developing a listening and engagement strategy surrounding that. So if you're interested in getting involved or want to learn more about it, please reach out to either me or Amanda Miller, and she'll drop our contact information in the chat there. So now I'd like to introduce Chris McCready, who will be co-facilitating today's discussion with me. Chris is the Manager of Technical Support and Integrated Data at the Department of Water Resources, and she is also one of the steering committee co-chairs at the consortium. So before I hand things over to Chris to formally introduce Anna, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you have suggestions for other Data for Lunch topics, please reach out to either me or Amanda and let us know your ideas. And then just to quickly orient you to the logistics and the flow of today, after Chris gives her introduction, she'll hand things over to Anna. Anna will give about a half-hour presentation. We'll then have time, about 15-20 minutes at the end for questions. Chris and I will be moderating those questions, so please drop any questions that you might have into the chat, and we'll be tracking those. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation. Alternatively, please feel free to raise your hand electronically. We'll be, again, tracking those, and then you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. And then finally, similar to our previous Data for Lunch events, our speaker has graciously agreed to stay on Zoom for informal discussion and questions, and that'll be after sort of the formal closing at 1 p.m. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, slides and a recording of today's presentation will be available on our website after the event. If you are not already subscribed to our listserv, please do so. That's where you'll receive updates on the recordings and presentation, as well as other events and news. So with that, I will hand things over to Chris to introduce Anna today.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to join Tara in welcoming you all to this Data for Lunch event today. And I'm especially pleased to introduce Anna Holder from the State Water Resources Control Board. Certainly, if you're registered, you would have probably had a chance to see her full bio on the event page, and it's available to you at any time. So I will encourage you to look there as well. But let me just make a few remarks about Anna from my own perspective. So she's an environmental scientist and tribal coordinator in the Water Board's Office of Information Management and Analysis. She holds Master of Science and Bachelor of Science degrees from CSU Monterey Bay, and her degrees are in applied marine and watershed science. She knows the value of data science, ecology, and science communication, which she uses on a daily basis to inform sustainable and equitable management of California's natural resources. And on a more personal note, I'll say that in my very limited, relatively limited interactions with Anna over the past several years, I can say that I certainly will see what others would see, which is that she's bright and articulate and a real go-getter. But I've been particularly struck by her characteristic encouragement of others with whom she works. She contributes to anything and everything she touches, and her contributions are marked by her interest in building, not just programs and events, which she does with flair, but also interpersonal connections and genuine understanding. So without further ado, please do join me in welcoming Anna to share with us what she's learned about using intentional engagement to advance equity, inclusion, and belonging in the water data community.
Wow.
Take it away, Anna.
Thanks for that super kind introduction, Chris, and welcome, y'all. My name's Anna Holder. As Chris said, I'm an environmental scientist at the California State Water Resources Control Board, and to get all of the lame governmental acronyms out of the way, I'm also going to be talking about the office that I work in, which is the Office of Information Management and Analysis, or OIMA, and many others that we'll kind of walk through together. But before I dive into my presentation today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge tribal lands and waters in California and express my deep gratitude for the ancestral and native homelands where I am today in Sacramento, California, and the local tribes who have been and continue to be stewards of these lands and waters include the Nishnah, Maidu, and Miwok peoples, and the Putwin and Wintun nations. And it's important for me to take a moment to recognize these peoples and acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices that have been forced upon them. And in acknowledging and remembering these communities and all of the work that I do, I really hope to honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. So with that, I also wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. You know, you heard my titles and things like that, but I'm also a daughter and a sister and an auntie. And I've had a lot of great opportunities in my academic and professional careers to educate myself on a variety of the topics that we'll be covering today. And using that learning and those principles in a wide variety of contexts, from one-on-one meetings with colleagues to larger events and conferences that we'll be talking about later. And I think importantly, I've adopted a growth mindset, which some of you might already be familiar with, but we'll talk about and dive into what I mean by that in a little bit later too. So I wanted to kind of highlight some recent larger scale engagement and equity efforts that I've been a part of. The first of which being the California Water Data Science Symposium and California Water Data Challenge. I'm actually here today, I think, because of the California Water Data Science Symposium and the consortium and other partners' interest in kind of learning how the heck we do that and how do we make it welcoming and engaging, hopefully year after year. And so I'll be kind of touching on these different efforts, and at the back of this slide deck, there's links to each of the efforts. So if you're interested in something in particular, there's resources to learn more. I also want to highlight and acknowledge that this work has been going on long before me. Tara mentioned AB 1755, but I also wanted to acknowledge the California Water Board's resolutions on open data in 2018 and racial equity in just November of last year. And note that OEMA and I have embraced these principles, and I really strive to operationalize those principles in my work, which operationalize is like a $5 word, but really just putting the principles into practice so that they're less abstract and more accessible for folks doing the work day to day. So we're going to go on a journey together today. Tighten your seatbelts. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over and kind of normalizing language around equity and really describing how I put those principles into practice. So I also want to underscore that we're going to be covering some pretty heavy topics today. And in no way am I trying to make us all experts. I think that in doing that in 30 minutes is like bonkers. People spend their whole careers just focusing on certain aspects of these topics. But my purpose today is to kind of introduce them to this community or remind us of the topics if you're already familiar, and normalize discussing them openly with one another in the community. And I hope that together during our Q&A portions, we can get curious and bring what we've learned together today. I'm hoping to learn from you also back into the important work that we all do in California and beyond. So this part's more for me than for you. I invite y'all to take a deep breath and let's dive in. So I want to start by talking about positionality and intersectionality. So positionality is essentially how our respective identities influence how we see and understand and walk through the world. And intersectionality refers to the really complex way interactions and the intersections of our identities can impact the cumulative discrimination and oppression some individuals or groups may experience. And here on the slide, we have an example of what this might look like in a corporate context. So we see that 21% of corporate leaders in the United States are women, 4% of those are women of color, and 1% of those are Black women. So we can see that the identities of gender and ethnicity and race really can play a factor in how women are able to work in the workplace. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the uncomfortable concept of privilege and power dynamics. And really, I'm doing this because it's important for me to, in my work, to understand the societal privilege and power that I have that potentially has not been earned when I walk into a physical or virtual room because of the identities and experiences that I have. I'm a white woman and I have some degrees and I work for a regulatory agency. So that can kind of bring up some different privilege and power whenever I'm in a certain room or context with others. And I think it's also important for me to understand those pieces in the context of the broader institutions and systems that I work in. So, you know, the bullets on the slide is really, can be pretty hefty, right? But really understanding the history of our institutions and our systems, and that they have been historical agents of oppression, and understanding how those historical decisions can impact the work that I do today and the communities that we serve. So a great example of this is redlining, which is a racist land use practice of the 1930s. And although the lines were drawn in the 1930s, communities of color in particular still experience persistent environmental and social injustice because of those decisions. And they face those today, along with other burdens. And so there's a link at the bottom of this slide to a really great resource called Pollution and Prejudice that an awesome team at Cali, PA has put together. And it really kind of talks through that example in more detail. And just acknowledging that privilege and power exist, and treating it like the elephant in the room is not helpful. And so trying to normalize acknowledging that big old elephant so that he doesn't have to be in therapy. I also want to underline that when we think of privilege and power dynamics, we're maybe thinking of it in a negative context. But I also want to underscore that power in itself isn't good or bad. It's really about how we use it. And so there's a different couple of types of power. There's power over, which is essentially what we were talking about, where that a person or institution of power operates to privilege certain others while marginalizing other groups. Power with is really finding common ground. The term I use often is partnership with others to build collective strength. Power to refers to an individual's potential to shape their life or the world. And power within speaks to our own sense of personal self-worth and abilities to kind of make that change. There's a lot of nuance in the different types of power, but I wanted to underscore and compare power over and power with. And specifically in the water data community and the consortium context, acknowledge that AB 1755 and open data resolutions are really trying to take us from the space of power over, where we hoard data and information, to power with, where we share data and information and empower our partners to do their thing. We also hear a lot about the frustration, at least I do with my colleagues, the frustration around working in organizational or data silos. Again, that's kind of an artifact of power over principles and practices of our past, and really wanting to move into working collectively within systems and engaging together within systems. And note that in the work that I do, I have been challenged by some folks who will say things like, well, is this an efficient use of our state resources? No, but efficiency in the instance of operationalizing equity in the work that I do, efficiency is not the goal. Effectiveness and inclusion is, and doing that well requires time and more resources than we might be used to giving to this work. So many of us have probably seen this graphic of equality versus equity, but again, just normalizing language here. Equality really speaks to the equal distribution of resources. So we can see on the left that each individual has a single crate, whereas equity is about the distribution of resources in the context of individual circumstances so that we all achieve equal outcomes. So we see that there are different numbers of crates, but the outcome is everyone can see the baseball game. Yeah, baseball, sport. And in the work that I do, we often hear, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, as terms. And I think for me, it's really important to connect those to specific questions so that I can think through what they mean in the work that I do. I also was really intentional about including the term belonging in this title and in the work that I do. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are foundational and critical and so important. But in my view, they shouldn't be our end goal. We should really be striving for belonging, where everyone's included and feels like they belong in the organizations and the process and the conversations and the communities. And from the limited experience that I have, when we're able to create that sense of belonging with our partners, that's when we really get the exciting and engaging and effective and innovative conversations and teams and products. And that eventually, if we can scale it to organizational and systemic levels, that's when we get exciting organizations and communities. So the work that I do, I really try and put those kind of sometimes abstract principles into practice. And I do that by being intentional, inclusive, flexible, and making space for hard things. And so for the next part of my presentation, I'm going to kind of talk through what that looks like for me on my day-to-day work. When it comes to being intentional, it's really just pausing and asking myself a bunch of questions, or asking our teams a bunch of questions. I think in my experience, it can be really easy to get overwhelmed with meeting the deadlines and doing the work and meeting the mission, because there's a lot there already. But I have found that investing the time that it takes to take a moment to think, what are we doing again? Is that aligning with the future us that we want to create? Is that aligning with our original vision and values and purpose? And taking the time to adjust if needed, or just to be like, yeah, we're good. Okay, let's keep moving. That investment in time can be small or large based on bandwidth and capacity and all sorts of things. But whatever you can do to pause and think about your intentions and the work that you do, and in my experience, the work that I've done has been tremendously valuable. Circling back to that inclusivity. So again, lots of questions on the slide, but I think the best example of how we've done this is by telling a story about the California Water Data Science Symposium. So in 2019, I was a California Sea Grant Fellow, Sea Grant, and it was my first symposium where I helped other folks in OEMA put on this massive and awesome conference and event. And we did our great job. We had lots of amazing speakers, but there was a person in the audience who stood up and pointed out that the people in the audience and the speakers and management didn't look like them. And like, what's up with that? And in that moment, in the room, back in the before times when we were in person, the room got really tense, because I think we could have had a couple things happen. The person that responded as part of OEMA could have been defensive, and that wouldn't have created a great space, right? But instead, the conversation was, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Let's talk more about how we can change that. And that's what we did. So we onboarded that person to lead an advisory committee to help inform the structure and conversations that would be centered during the next year's symposium. It was fantastic. And since then, we've really taken that practice of thinking about who's been included in the past, who's missing, which voices can we elevate in this time, in this moment that we have together, and what does that look like for them, and what does that look like for us? And so we're continuing to do that in the Water Data Science Symposium and California Water Data Challenge this year, and it's kind of becoming part of the ethos of the project. We don't get it right every time. We're humans, we mess up, but we really try and incorporate that into all of the planning and all of the work that we do. Being flexible, I think, is best encapsulated with this quote here. Perhaps the most dangerous phrase in the English language is, that's the way it's always been done. And I've heard that. I've worked from local to federal agencies and partnered with international organizations. And I've heard that a lot. Well, that's the way we've always done it. So we're just gonna move forward with that. And that makes me cranky, number one. And I don't think that's a reason. And when it comes to being flexible, those of you, I see a lot of familiar names in the audience. Those of you that work with me closely know that I am the queen of self-imposed deadlines. So for me, being flexible looks like oh, is that timeline an Anna issue? Like, can we extend that out? What does that mean? And which things are really firm, which things cannot be moved? And really thinking about other ways that we can lower barriers and create on-ramps for participation and partnership and engagement. We've learned through the Science Symposium and other events, this talk is an example, the benefit of virtual experiences can have in terms of broadening our audiences and increasing accessibility to content and people and information. I know we're all craving in person, but as we move into whatever our new normal will be, I think it's important for us to think about how we can kind of pair what we're learning from this 2-year virtual experiment and bring the really great things with us into the future. I also think it's important for us to make space for hard things, specifically conversations around vulnerability, just hard conversations in general, and failing forward. And I want to note that in my experience, it's been important for the people that hold the privilege and power in the meeting or whatever context, agency, whatever, to be the ones to carve out the space for these things and really value them and make them a priority and part of the incorporated vision of whatever we're doing. I just think that's so critical. So if you're writing an agenda or leading a team or an organization or a company or whatever, really think about how you might try and do this in the work that you do. So I follow the work of Dr. Brene Brown very closely. She's a vulnerability and shame researcher, storyteller, and she defines risk or vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, and notes that a lot of us may have been taught that vulnerability is the same thing as weakness, but her rigorous data sets, decades of data have shown that actually vulnerability is our most accurate measure of courage, and it's the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. And especially in the water world, we talk a lot about being innovative. And I think what's really important for us to remember is that innovation not only requires vulnerability, but it requires us to fail. Not accept that we might fail, but know deep in our bones that if we want to be truly innovative and push the envelope and create the future that we're all working towards, we will fail. And also, that's okay, y'all. It's important to learn from it, right? And so I'll end with, vulnerability is the absolute heartbeat of innovation and creativity, and there can be zero innovation without vulnerability. So in my work, this has looked like kind of airing out areas of improvement. I like to call them opportunities of improvement. When I started in my current role in 2020, I was onboarded onto the bioaccumulation monitoring program, and we created this process realignment where we basically gather and community representatives to talk about like the areas where we haven't really been succeeding and how can we work together to change that for the future. This has resulted in new insights and solutions and problem solving. The program is going into a really exciting new direction, and we've developed resources that have actually been useful for the communities that we serve. Again, circling back to difficult and uncomfortable conversations. I think it's important for us to remember that doing this willy-nilly is like not advised. And doing it well takes practice and work and requires vulnerability, trust, and respect, all things that are really built up in relationships over time. And reminding ourselves that the magic that we want to create in the work that we do cannot be achieved if we sit within our comfort zones. And also noting that avoiding the difficult and uncomfortable conversation or issue doesn't make it go away. It actually gives it an opportunity to fester and grow and become much, much worse. So there's a guide for groups and teams on how to work through this process that I highly recommend. And just noting that I've put these principles into practice on, during symposium, keynotes and panels and the realignment meetings and just conversations with my colleagues on a day-to-day basis. And it's really helped improve not only the conversation and productivity, but I think it also helps us, especially in this virtual world that we're in right now, connecting to people on like a human to human level, talking through hard things. I've mentioned failing forward a couple times, and for me that requires a growth mindset. So that term was coined by Dr. Dweck, I think the name is on this figure, and noting that a fixed mindset is basically one where an individual believes that their abilities and skills and talents cannot be improved, regardless of how much work they put into doing so. Whereas a growth mindset is one where a person believes those things can be developed and grown through effort and learning and practice. And so when I experience moments of failure or falling, that might be a better term to use if failure kind of can be triggering to some folks, I try and think of those moments as an opportunity. They hurt, y'all. We all know that. But acknowledging that and then immediately going to, what can I learn? How can we grow? What can we change in our process or partnerships or workflows to really evolve and iterate on whatever we just experienced to create a better thing moving forward? And so before we even try anything with this growth mindset, we think about like how things have changed since we tried last time, or if we've ever tried at all, and who can be the people that can give us constructive feedback so that we can build the best process or product or whatever moving forward. Where can we grow? Where do we need support? And certainly, how can we center around listening and learning from everyone in the room? And it might be kind of cheesy, but I also often kind of think to myself, dang, this is hard. But that's okay. And that's normal. And I know that with the community that I have and the people on our teams and partnerships, like we can do the hard things together. So these principles to operationalize equity for me have led to much clearer purpose and expectations, not only for me, but the folks that I'm working with and partnering with. We've been able to incorporate diverse perspectives and ideas and insights into their processes. And the flexibility has created easier on-ramps for engagement and participation and partnership, and really dedicating and investing the time and space to work through vulnerability, have the difficult conversations, and normalizing failing forward has resulted in opportunities for courage. I feel like the teams that I work with are totally courageous, built a lot of trust together over the past 3 years that I've been with the water boards. And we've had lots of meaningful conversations and insights, which have resulted in awesome learning and true innovation, I feel. I also, before we close, going back to having difficult conversations, I want to acknowledge some hard truths about this work. A lot of us are working in complex organizations and systems on nuanced and interconnected issues. Some might refer to it as wicked problems, right? That's like not nothing. It's a big deal. It's hard work. But the work to operationalize equity, inclusion, and belonging, in my experience, has been, logistically and emotionally difficult. And there's a lot of it to work through. I can't do it alone. I really need to lean on my team members, my partnerships, and the communities to really get to the success point. And it's taken more time and resources and funding than we maybe originally expected. And so if you're a person thinking about those things and making the decisions about how organizations, teams work, that's something to keep in mind. And also, I'd like to acknowledge that I am in a non-regulatory office, and there's just some extra level of tension that happens in regulatory spaces, and that is, again, not nothing. I'd like for us to end these slides on hope. It can be really easy in the world that we live in today to get overwhelmed. And for me, what keeps me going is honestly this Twitter, even though I'm not a Twitter person. But when I saw this, it re-energizes me to remember that, yes, the problems that we're working on are complicated and interconnected, and they're systemic. They're everywhere. But that means that wherever I am, whatever thread I can pull to make change can have ripple effects to everything else. And so the more of us that do this work, we can hopefully achieve the equity outcomes and the belonging that we're all kind of craving and looking for over the long term, and also maybe get there a little bit faster. So with that, I'd love to answer some questions and start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Anna. So great to hear what you have to say, and really appreciate your courage in sharing what you've learned. We have had a few questions show up in the chat, but I'm going to be a little bit self-serving here and check in with you and see if my understanding of things aligns with your understanding of things. When we talk about efficiency, I just recently had this conversation with somebody, maybe not so informed by the definition, but efficiency, one definition of it is it's the ratio of useful work performed by a system or a person or a machine or whatever relative to the total energy expended. And so when we hear about efficiency and how it's inefficient to have all this inclusiveness, I think whoever says that it's inefficient is probably focused only on that total energy expended. And I really believe that the amount of useful work is greatly enhanced by including more people in the conversations, the decision making, the gathering of intel, all of it. And so does that align with your experience, Anna?
Yeah, I love that insight. And when I'm in those conversations where people are asking about the efficiency of this process, the thing that I usually say is, I'd rather do something well than fast. And I think it's important to invest in ourselves and our future selves as individuals and communities and organizations to take the time that's required to make sure we're not just going through the motions and checking boxes, right? And really getting to the efficiency definition that you just brought up, which I think is great.
Thanks. Let's see. Yeah, go ahead, Tara.
I just want to say a huge thank you, Anna, and I see a lot of props being shared in the chat. So thank you all for sharing that, and really for such a wonderful presentation, Anna. So I guess we have some questions coming in chat. I also see that Michelena has her hand raised. But just as we go into the question session, you've covered a lot, and you've covered a lot of really important, really challenging, and really a lot of materials that I feel like can be unpacked through time. And before we sort of delve into some of the more targeted questions, I'm curious if you could just talk briefly, Anna, about what you hope people will take away from today's conversation.
Yeah, thanks for reiterating that. There was a lot that we just covered in, what was it, like 25 or 30 minutes? I might have gone over time. Sorry about that. But yeah, my hope is to really inspire curiosity and conversation, and normalizing that curiosity and conversation in the communities in which we work. I think it's taken me years and years and years to educate myself on these topics. And every day there's something else that's like, oh man, I should have read that author. I should have known about that thing already. And that's just like a feeling that's normal for me now. And so that's another reason why I've adopted and felt really glad that I've adopted this growth mindset, because I know that I personally, and we can continue to learn and grow as we find new resources and learn new things and have new experiences, and really like just kind of incorporating that into our lives and our work, at least for me, has been really helpful. So yeah, I think just underscore, I hope that this enables people to be curious. I have lots of resources at the back of this slide deck that'll be shared if people want to dive in more, and really start to normalize the conversation in the water data community.
Very cool. We had a question that came up in the chat from Michaela Tran with Sustainable Conservation, and she's asking, maybe you could say a little bit about the difference between the end goal of belonging versus justice.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. For me, when I think about justice, that's like a correction of our systems and our workflows and the specific outcomes that people experience on a day-to-day basis when they live their lives, right? For me, belonging is when individuals feel welcomed and encouraged to take up space in a conversation or a process or a room, and know deep in their bones that they're meant to be there, that they belong there. For me and many of my colleagues, the idea of imposter syndrome comes up a lot, which is a whole nother talk that we can have. But I think that's a real thing that people experience, and it's up to us to create the spaces where people know and feel deep in their bones that they belong, because that belonging and partnership, I feel, is going to be required to achieve the justice that we really seek. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you to Michaela for the great question.
I see that Michelina has her hand up. Would you like to go ahead and unmute yourself, Michelina, and ask your question? And then we have another great question from Barbara after that.
Great.
Great. Unmuted myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. So wonderful. My name is Michelina. I'm a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz who studies equity and water policy in California. So I think a lot about the very topic you're presenting on. And I've tried to stay up to date on the state water boards like institutionalization of equity and recognition of like pervasive and continual colonial oppression that obviously predates like the American period in which we're currently in. I've read this, just getting to my question, I've read this really great book recently called Upstream by Beth Middleton Manning, and she really focuses on how the Maidu and other indigenous nations along the Feather River have experienced continual displacement due to the creation of the state's water rights system and creation of like a central and state water projects, Central Valley state water projects. I was wondering if the State Water Board in its efforts to deal with and recognize equity issues will reallocate water rights as part of that. Like, will there be material change basically as a result of these recognitions of historical inequity?
Yeah, great big old question that you just landed there. Yeah, so I am very familiar with Dr. Middleton Manning's work, and they actually gave a webinar recently to the water boards, and I think it was open to the public. So awesome book. As far as speaking to what the water boards as a whole will do about water rights, unfortunately, I'm going to give you a hand-wavy bureaucratic answer because I'm not the person that can give you a response. I think that operationalizing equity in a huge organization, which the water boards is actually 10 separate agencies, is like a really hard thing. And bureaucracy is real and the work can feel really slow, but I'm hopeful that all parts of the water boards organization are doing their best to operationalize equity in all the work that we do. I know that's not the answer you wanted, but I don't feel comfortable speaking for the water boards as a whole and for a division that I'm not in or have any insight of their like inner workings.
Here's a good one, Anna. It's a long one, so I'm going to just read it off. This is from Heather Rose, and she's sharing her experience and looking for some advice. There has been broken trust between government and regulatory agencies and communities of color. Today, we're asking for their feedback and input on upcoming endeavors, but we're having difficulty getting audience members we need to hear from to attend community meetings. Mm-hmm. So the meetings are virtual and they take place after hours. And the personal thoughts of Heather are that folks don't attend because of a lack of direct outreach from the government agency and broken trust with the communities. So here comes the punchline. Why should they attend and give feedback when their thoughts or needs have been ignored in the past? And what is your advice on regaining trust and inclusion with communities of color?
Yeah, that's a great question. Trust is really important in all of the work that I do, and especially in the engagement and partnership that I try and develop as a tribal coordinator for the Office of Information Management Analysis. And you're absolutely right. There's generations of broken trust and generational trauma that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And in my experience, my intentions on the work that I'm doing and the fact that I really authentically want their feedback and input are actually not what's important. And so for me, it has been important to carve out time and space to center relationships and trust building, and really meet people where they are. I think it can be frustrating sometimes because like, I know my intentions are good and I know that the work that I'm doing might benefit or will benefit those communities that I'm reaching out to, but I am one person from a massive organization and I'm not the only one making requests. And so I think for me, the game changer has been to understand that complexity and really have empathy for the person or community or institution that I'm trying to partner with, and meet them where they are and start from there, and know that having rushed timelines to satisfy deadlines or outcomes, it's not helpful. So that means maybe we need to rethink our workflows, right? And figure out a balance. And I don't have the answer to that in all contexts, but one example of how I'm doing this in my work. So I mentioned the realignment before. That started in the San Diego region last year. And I was a new tribal coordinator at the time, and I allocated 6 months to engaging with tribes and communities and regional partners and things like that. Anyone that has done community engagement work is probably like laughing out of their chair because 6 months is meaningless and it's not enough, right? But that's all I had. And so I did my best with what I had. But I quickly learned that what I had is not enough, and I needed to create new space and new time to start the engagement process sooner. So the San Diego realignment is a 3-year process. We're in year 2. There's 2023, and then we're going to start it in another region to be determined in 2024. This year, we are dedicating the year to statewide tribal engagement, not to get tribes to do anything, right? But to provide opportunity for relationship building, for meet and greets, to match names to faces and meet each other as humans and understand what's happening with my priorities and my projects and how that aligns with the priorities and needs and values of the almost 200 tribes in California. So that's a whole year that we didn't have in our timeline before that we created because we wanted to prioritize that. So that's kind of how I hope that answers your question. I know I kind of rambled a bit, but you're absolutely right that just walking into a room and being like, just trust us, is like bonkers, and we should not do that.
Thank you so much, Anna. We're getting so many fantastic questions, so thank you all. I wanted to tee up 2 questions together. One is from Barb and one from Arev. And so the first question is, can you share some specific examples of how you practice introducing some of the concepts that you spoke about during your presentation today, Anna, in our day-to-day work? So for example, in sort of internal meetings or with familiar colleagues. And then sort of a more pointed example around that is, can you share a specific time when you were trying to engage with a group and you witnessed a lack of belonging or equity, and how did you overcome some of those barriers? So I think people are really trying to dig into practically what does this look like and what are some good ways that you've helped to address this?
Yeah, I might have you repeat the second part later, but to start diving into like what this has looked like for me, a lot of it is self-education and like learning the darkest parts of our history and understanding how that has impacts to the lives of that people are living today, and practicing vulnerability and empathy with myself, and then learning what that looks like for the teams that I work with, the partners that I work with. An example of how to like carve out space for these sorts of conversations on like a team unit meeting, we'll start our one-on-ones or our check-ins with like, how are you doing? But no, really, how are you in the world right now as a human? How are you doing? That can be, I am a millennial, don't come at me, but I like a good meme. And so there might be a box of like 6 or 8 memes of funny dogs or cats or unicorns, whatever, with different facial expressions. And we'll say on a scale of meme, how are you feeling today? And it's like, well, I feel like that dog with the Frisbee because like everything's coming at me right now and I just can't even. If you don't have time to dive into that for the meeting, it could be as simple as a 2-word check-in, right? So, we start the meeting and Tara asks, okay, team, we're gonna go around and I want you to tell me 2 words that describe how you're feeling today. We don't need any explanation, just the 2 words, and we're gonna keep moving because the time. But by making space for the 2-word check-in, maybe one of my colleagues says a word that like, I want to circle back with them on that. And so I might send them a chat message or give them a call and say, hey, during our 2-word check-in, you mentioned this thing, like, do you want to talk about that? Let's say more. And bigger, like more publicly facing instances, the best example I think is the advisory committee that we have for the realignment. We try and carve out time for reflection at the end of each meeting. So we all leave meetings and then think about what happened and how we're feeling about it and how it might have been a waste of our time or whatever, or how awesome it was. And we really invite folks to have those moments of reflection together so that we can learn from that. And the first time we did that, shout out to Mike Entos, who was the co-facilitator for this work. I was really nervous. It was my first big meeting like that. And we had that time for reflection. And I was like bracing myself for, this wasn't worth my time. Why am I here? You didn't cover anything. Like all of the, things that I tell myself and that my internal gremlins remind me of on a day-to-day basis. And the feedback we received was, this is great. We did so much more than we thought we were going to. I'm really excited for the next meeting. And being able to hear that from many people kind of helps, for me, again, build that human to human connection, but then also like elevate the momentum for the next conversation that we have together, because people are excited to recreate that process and that progress and that feeling together. And now I forgot the last part of the question.
No problem. And what we'll do, I think, is I'll read it, and it really asks this question about what can you give an example of a time when you were trying to engage with a group and witnessed a lack of belonging and equity and some barriers surrounding that, and how did you overcome it? And I'm just going to flag, Anna, that we're close to time. I'm going to let you wrap up, and then Chris is going to transition us to sort of this informal discussion.
Cool. Yeah, I think I observe those moments often, right? Because as institutions and systems and organizations, we maybe haven't achieved the equity outcomes that we want yet. They're in progress. And so when I do witness those, I try and lean into community, whatever that looks like for me at the time, and think about how I can be part of the change that we want to see, so that we build the relationships and partnerships to overcome whatever injustice we're trying to overcome. And someone still wants a detailed example.
So Anna, how do you feel about, you keep thinking about a specific example, and we'll hope that the asker will join us in the informal segment, which is coming up right now. Yeah. But just in case we need to let folks go at 1, I will, on behalf of the Water Data Consortium and this entire group of folks, just thank you so very much, all of you, each and every one of you, for spending some time with us today in general, and then spending time with us on this topic in particular. It's really great to have all of you showing the interest, and I don't think I can thank Anna enough for courageously sharing what she's learned, and we'll all continue to learn together. I love that. And so is there any other housekeeping item, Tara, that I need to mention here? I think as we move into this next half hour, we'll have everyone able to come off mute and pose their questions. It'll be a lot more of a fireside chat style. Is that correct?
That is right. And we've had a couple of requests, but just so everyone's clear, recordings and presentation, the slides from today's presentation will be available on our website later this week.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
We're going to come off mute, and Anna, maybe you have had time to think of an example, but there may be others here who may have examples that they want to share as well. And so this is kind of a great opportunity for this group to really learn from one another. So over to you, Anna, but would also encourage others if they have examples that they are willing to share.
I think a really great example, again, we haven't necessarily achieved the equity outcomes that we want yet, but I think the pollution and prejudice team at Cali, PA, really witnessed a need and the injustice and inequity around historical prejudice and institutional racism, and how that impacts the communities that are most burdened by pollution in California. And their work to make open the history and the education and the learnings of that process, that history, and then also utilize data to empower learning and visualization of the connections of historical actions and current pollution is really empowering. And I think utilizing data to inform our education and future decisions is a really great first step. I have a feeling I haven't completely answered the question because it's complicated. I can't think of any specific example where I think we did it, we don't have any more work to do, right? It's ongoing. It's taken generations, hundreds and hundreds of years to get us in this mess. It's not going to be achieved or solved after 1 3-hour meeting or even 3 years or a decade of work. This is like continuous work and energy and community and effort, in my opinion.
Thank you, Anna. No, these are complicated questions
Yeah.
that are being asked. So I see Jay Hartman has his hand up, and then we have a question from Yvonne that she asked earlier that I think it would be great to hear. So Yvonne, I think you're still on here and would encourage you to come off mute maybe after Jay has asked his question. And if you're willing to ask it, if not, I'm happy to also read it on your behalf. Jay Hartman.
Hi, I feel sorry to go before Yvonne. My name is Elena Hartman, and I do work for the State Water Board. And I want to say this is an amazing presentation. Thank you for putting so much thought into this. And I want to circle back to the question that came up that Heather Rose brought up, because it's been a topic that's been really, really an intriguing question, especially if we think about all the regulatory work that agencies are trying to now make more inclusive and to truly, bring into the fold perspectives that have not been heard. And I think your response was spot on. And just because you're so good at putting together disparate pieces that sometimes don't quite have an obvious connection, I want to put this out both for your thoughts right now, but perhaps keep it on your radar for the future. And I wonder if an additional component is to try to understand community as a whole. And what I mean by that is that in addition to meeting people where they are, in addition to creating space and time, it is, in addition to rebuilding the trust, it is also trying to approach a community in a more unified and coherent way, not in a fragmented way as agencies tend to do. And I'm now picking on state agencies because I just want to say I've observed it, but it's not just the state agencies. Almost on a daily basis, we seek input on one topic after another. There may be, Air Board has some proposal. There are topics to hear about water quality, contaminants, rising seas. We do want to hear from the people, but I do want to highlight that often it is very few people who are capable to keep track of so many disparate efforts. Think about even in our own work, us connecting with so many people, having a different network of folks, but within a community that we want to hear from, maybe it's one people, or if it's a really fortunate, well-to-do group that truly came together and they're so organized, they can put more people to it. But it's upon them to keep track of all us agencies with all our plans and drafts and orders and comments. You get it. So how do we make this a more, I lack a better word, more leveraged way to seek out these thoughts and to hear from people in a way that it's, in the end, not just trying to understand their thoughts on water topic of the day that we want to hear from, but how do we get them and see them more as a whole person or a community that they are versus just some opinion on our proposed something. So I have a lot more to say, but I hope I at least asked this question clearly enough. And thank you, if you're able to get to share your thoughts now or at some later point.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great observation. And again, like throughout my presentation, same, I'm not picking on any particular agency. This is a worldwide issue that we're facing. No large agency or organization is exempt from that. And I think to your point of really engaging with communities as whole communities, part of that for me is understanding, again, the context, the connective tissue, the issues that are of concern for those communities, whatever they may be. And I think how to connect with them, that's a hard thing. But for me and a lot of the work that I do, it really boils down to effective communication. One of the things that we identified in our review of the bioaccumulation monitoring program is that we had a lot of detailed technical reports on our websites. Pretty sure no one reads those, y'all. Like, they're big and long and no one's got time for that. And so what we're trying to do is really develop shorter, more digestible ways to interact with not only the program and our process in general, but the data and information that we spend, collectively as our agencies and organizations, millions of dollars collecting data and really, putting a complicated dashboard on a website. Is that really doing the most? I don't think it is, right? So really connecting the dots for folks and making to digest and provide those easy on-ramps. That's one thing that we've been actually spending a lot of time and energy investing in over the past couple of years. But yeah, it's a complicated issue, and also acknowledging that our brains try and group things together because that's easier for our brains to understand. But when we're grouping groups of people to a quote unquote community, acknowledging that there's nuance, there's a mythical monolith that people kind of maybe assign to, oh, everyone in this community thinks the same or needs the same thing, and that's not accurate. And so trying to balance the communication needs and also meeting the needs of the diversity within a single community is really important. And it's a balance, and it's not easy, but I think that's maybe where I'd start.
Thank you so much, Anna. And Chris, I don't know if we were going to invite Yvonne, I think, to come off. Oh,
yeah,
I see her.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really encouraging to hear you talk about using data better and making it more accessible to people. I'm really interested in geographic data, GIS stuff, and data visualization. And so one of the things that there's all of these kind of foundational assumptions that we have that we're working with, and these foundational structures we're working with that, are rooted in this very unjust history. And one of the things that I think about is when you're collecting data and creating data, how do you take these things that you've been talking about, where are they relevant for that? And what might we want to consider when we're creating and collecting data to try to incorporate what you were talking about?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's important for us as, data collectors and stewards to really understand that when we collect data or use data or build an application or a GIS map, there's a series of decisions and choices that we make and assumptions that we make, as you pointed to, Yvonne. And I think for me, it's really important to be transparent about what those assumptions are and why we've made them, so that people can kind of use that from how they're going to interpret whatever it is they're going to interpret. And this means having really detailed metadata, which is for data folks, it could be a pain in the butt filling in the metadata information, but it's so critical for connecting the dots between like the raw data or GIS layers and making meaningful conclusions and informing decisions down the road. And so an example of how we're trying to do this in the Office of Information Management and Analysis and the California Water Quality Monitoring Council is through the Healthy Watersheds Partnership. And we're in the process of developing this really awesome and cool and complicated data dashboard that people can use to hopefully someday do a complete assessment of watershed health in California. And just acknowledging that, like, we're making that thing for a specific purpose and documenting the decisions that we're making and the assumptions that we're making and the choices that we're making. Why are we using this data set and not that data set? And also acknowledging that there are lots of other efforts underway to do similar but slightly different things. And being transparent about what other efforts are out there and when it's appropriate to use one resource or data set to come to a certain conclusion versus when it's more appropriate to use another one. And I think that helps increase the clarity so that when we get to the point of talking about, okay, what does this mean for operationalizing equity in our work? We're really clear about the purpose of the data, the original purpose of the data, and how that aligns with our purpose and vision that we're trying to achieve with whatever thing we're doing, right? The regulation that we're developing, or the program that we're developing, or the dashboard that we're developing, whatever it is, understanding how the original purpose of the data set or the visualization that we're using aligns or doesn't with the purpose of what we're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Anna. Deb, do you have your electronic hand up?
I do. So what's occurred to me, because we do a somehow related process in engaging with our scientists at the lab that I'm at, and one thing that occurred to me, you talked a lot about how you get those people to the table, how you get them engaged in the process. But I guess what that brought up for me is thinking about, how do you enable the out-of-the-box thinking? How do you enable that completely different approach or different toolbox for solving these problems? Because, we've already heard about these things like in wildfire, that in fact the Indians have had a great way of dealing with managing their forests for eons, and the Westerners came in and came up with a completely different approach, which sucked. And, I think same with water, there's similar stories, I'm sure. And I guess the question is, how do you engage with these groups in a way that can enable those, like, yeah, I get it, you're going down this path, but have you thought about this other path that's way over there that you've never even seen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I think the best example is the work that I've been doing with our realignment partners in the San Diego region. And we really try and continually check in with folks. So the first meeting, it was like, we're gathered here today because Anna and others had this vision. What do you think about that? Does that align with your vision? Is that what you thought you were signing up for when you agreed to join this meeting? Should we revise our vision and priorities and conversation? What does that look like for you? And so in my experience, it's been really helpful to incorporate regular check-ins to make sure that we're still on the same page. And you mentioned paths, right? Are we still on the right path together? Or do we need to veer to a different one? Do we need to get on a more wiggly path? What are the things that we want to prioritize given our current limitations of time and resources on the path that we're on, versus documenting and acknowledging the other ideas or priorities or needs that may be way over there, but we should circle back to those at some point, and providing lots of opportunities to build those shared lists and understandings and learning, so that we can make sure that we're all on the same path together, and there's space to adjust the agenda during the meeting, right? If someone says, hey, I have this really great out of the box idea. It's kind of not related, but I think it's important. We might do a pulse check with everyone else. Hey team, what else do you think? Do we want to, pin these pieces of the agenda and circle back to this? Like, what do we want to do together instead of really having command and control of the process as I thought it might have looked? Does that make sense?
Can I ask just a quick follow-up before we go to Donna's question? Chris, you okay with it?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. I'm sorry.
So I guess my question is, when you're doing that rechecking in, are you doing it where this person is in the minority, or are you doing it when they're in their community and have an opportunity? Because you do get a different answer. If I'm still the only person from a particular community and I know that everybody else has a plan to build that dam, and I think we ought to divert the water to a wetland or something, right? How privileged do I feel about speaking up about doing something dramatically different when the steamroller is running down the road and I'm trying to say, wait, but we wanted a dirt road.
Yeah. So all of my recent engagement has occurred under the real constraints of a global pandemic. And so a lot of my engagement has been virtual at this point. I haven't had the privilege or the opportunity to actually physically be in communities and talk to folks so like they can see that I have feet, and like a whole human body. It's just like from the neck up, right? And so I think maybe I can't fully respond to your question in that sense, because I do agree that like there's a different vibration in conversation when you're physically with people. I will say that what we're learning from the realignment process, what I'm learning from the realignment process, is starting conversations earlier and normalizing and valuing those, those out of the box ideas, and letting people know that like those are welcome, and that maybe our advisory committee are steering the process and I'm just there to support and facilitate. That I think has been really helpful. But again, that's a new process and we're still learning. And if anyone else has a better response to Deb's question, I'd love to hear what you're learning too.
And just we have a couple more questions, Anna. So I know Ada had a question that she wanted to ask, and then Donna had also posed a question in chat, and we'll come off mute to ask that. So over to you, Ada.
Okay, cool. Hi, Anna. How's it going?
Hi, Rev.
So my question is, and you might have like gone over this already, but I'm curious, is there any feedback you can share from tribal community members or other community members you've tried to engage with that have you gotten any feedback like a before and after you've started engaging with them? Like what's been the difference like?
Yeah, I'd say we aren't in the after phase yet. It's in progress. But I think the biggest piece of feedback that we've received that we're still like really grappling with from a tribal perspective is related to tribal data sovereignty, right? So acknowledging that the close to 200 tribes in California are their own sovereign governments, and our institutions and systems have had a history and behavior of collecting data on these folks to help inform our decisions. But like, how can we do better about giving tribes control over their data? And what does that mean for our water data infrastructure and data stewardship? Like, it's complicated. And we're still learning on what that looks like. But I think, getting to your after point, again, we're not there yet, but I think having those open conversations about like what that might look like from the certain tribal perspectives that we have at our table and what their priorities and needs are can help inform how we might evolve our data infrastructure and our systems moving forward, so that that equity is embedded deep in the databases in the code. Like, it's all there from start to finish. And we got a long way to go before we can get there. And there's a lot of logistical and legal challenges that we have to work through. But I think we're starting those conversations, and that's giving me a lot of hope.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. So
And,
we have a few in the queue, right? And
we
about
do.
9 minutes left. So
exactly.
yeah.
But
So I
great that
believe
we're
Donna.
yeah, great that we
Yes.
are
Oh yeah.
getting
What a
this.
great problem. Yes. So is Donna next, and then
That's
trying to remember
right.
the name.
Yeah, and I
Heather,
think
right.
Donna had requested that I ask the question, so happy to do so. So in chat, she asked, Anna, you presented a slide earlier that says if it costs more money, takes more time, and cares for more people, it's decolonial. And so her question is essentially, aren't we being more responsible with taxpayers' dollars by being more efficient with time and money? I'm so curious to hear your response.
I think that depends on what your priorities are. It comes down to that. If the priority for using taxpayer dollars is to collect all the data in 2 weeks and put it on a dashboard, then yeah, there's more efficient ways to do that. The resolutions that the water boards has adopted over the past couple years around open data and racial equity have informed my work and really empower me to think about doing things as efficiently as we can to, use taxpayer dollars wisely. But especially when it comes to racial equity, being efficient and only efficient hasn't really served us well. So if we just continue to prioritize efficiency, I don't think we are. And so in terms of like, are we using, state resources appropriately? What do you mean by appropriately? And for me, that means operationalizing equity and justice and belonging in my work. And that takes a different kind of time and space and than maybe we've been operating previously.
Thank you, Anna. And then, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, just Heather, I think, is next, and it might just take us all the way out to the end here. But Heather, go ahead and ask, and we'll enjoy hearing you.
Yeah, can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great talk. I'm actually in Texas, so appreciate the insight. I had a question about kind of a follow-up question to my community trust building. So I had a situation where I did have a community member take the time and show me around his neighborhood and show areas that need improvement, and then take it back to the city and basically the folks who are in charge of making those improvements. And I'm sure a lot of folks here work for government. There's a long list of projects we need to work on, and we don't have enough resources to get to everybody in a timely manner. So this poor man had spent time, worked with us, and then heard nothing back. So I would imagine that his trust is pretty broken, right? Like, he took the time and heard nothing. So I was just wondering if you had an experience with that, with tribal relations of, you build this relationship, you talk about projects, and then your government entity comes back and says, no, we're not going to do that for XYZ reasons. How do you keep that trust?
Great question. For me, there's like multiple layers of trust. Highly recommend, I think, Charles Feltman's book, The Thin Book of Trust, and the Brene Brown Research Group's resources on braving. For me, in that sort of experience, I had a partner say, hey, we really need you to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think trust is built when everything works out and everyone gets what they want, right? For me, the trust is built when I'm able to say, I love that idea. I see it as very valuable. However, here's my scope. Here's what I can do. And here are my limitations. Like, how can we partner to find the right people to talk to, the different resources that can help solve the crux of the issue. And I think for me, more trust is built when we're able to be transparent about like the real limitations that we're facing. Tribes, communities, and organizations, they're all facing lots and lots of things to do with, limited resources and time. So I think it's important to like ground ourselves and remind ourselves of what we can do given our limited capacity and resources, and having that transparent conversation of, so in your example, what I might have done was followed up with that person and said, hey, thank you so much for taking the time to, introduce me to your community and, take me on the tour. I so valued that. And I'm so glad that we were able to develop that, our relationship and that partnership. Unfortunately, I followed up like I said I was going to do, and I talked to these people like I said I was going to do, and unfortunately their response has been this, for these reasons, whatever you can give. And it might not be the response that people want, but I think the trust is built in knowing that you're going to be transparent about the process, good, bad, ugly, or otherwise, right? And so just because in that specific moment, you might not have been able to deliver on something that they had hoped you'd been able to deliver on, but maybe next time they know, hey, Heather was really honest with me and valued the time that I invested in our partnership. And I'd really like to try and work with that person again in this other way. And I think that's where the trust is kind of birthed.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. It wasn't my direct thing, but this is kind of like someone I know this happened to, and
yeah, no,
I'm sure it's a very common problem. So
I think it's very common. And also, thanks for joining from Texas. Welcome.
Yeah.
Well, we are, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I don't know. Either way, we're co-hosting, so we're having the debate right in front of you on who closes. But I think I can speak for Tara and myself, and also Anna and Amanda, all of us on the hosting side of this, how much we appreciate you not only joining for the first hour, but sticking around and having this dynamic conversation during the last half hour. It's been wonderful to hear from all of you. And I think it's safe to say that while we may not agree on everything, I think this is one of those opportunities to have a difficult but meaningful conversation, as opposed to avoiding a difficult conversation and skipping out on the meaning. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll look forward to sharing the recording and the notes again. As we mentioned earlier a couple times, they'll be on the events page later this week, and we encourage you to keep tabs on the Data for Lunch series and join us again in a few months when we have another one. Really, really appreciate you all.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good